The sun bled red over dry mesa, its dying light clawing at the horizon. A hot wind swept through the cracked earth, stirring red dust into spirals that danced across the sagging porch of Wade Harlan's ranch. The air smelled of scorched grass and forgotten rain, heavy with the weight of another merciless day. Wade, 34, tall and lean, his face weathered like old leather, drove his small herd of cattle toward the corral. His boots crunched against the parched ground, the sound swallowed by the howl of the wind. His hat, tilted low, hid eyes that had seen too many empty sunsets. The ranch was a lonely speck in the vastness of the mesa, its wooden walls faded to gray, the dry well by the porch a cruel reminder of 3 rainless summers. Wade tied his old horse to a post, his calloused hands moving with the rhythm of a man who spoke more to animals than to people. He was a cowboy, not by choice, but by survival. A man who had lost his mother to fever at 10 and learned early that the world cared little for the weak. His life was the creak of saddle leather, the lowing of cattle, and the endless wind that carried no answers. As he turned to check the gate, a shadow caught his eye. There, at the edge of the corral, stood a figure, small against the burning expanse of the mesa. A woman, her dress caked with red dust, clutched a worn canvas bag as if it anchored her to the earth. Her hair, golden and tangled, whipped in the wind, and her eyes, green as the memory of spring, held a fierce pride that seemed out of place in this desolate land. Wade stopped, his hand resting on the gatepost, and studied her. She was no drifter, no lost soul begging for scraps, so she stood like someone who had chosen this place, though God only knew why. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite a faint tremble. "I'm Isabel Thornton. You got my letter, didn't you?" Wade nodded, his throat dry as the well behind him. "Got it. Figured you wouldn't show. This ain't a place for city folk." His voice was low, rough like gravel, shaped by years of silence. Isabel's eyes didn't waver. "I lost everything back east. My home, my kin, my name. If I'm to lose more, I'd rather it be for something I chose." Her words hung in the air, sharp and heavy, like a blade drawn in the quiet. Wade said nothing at first. He looked at her, at the dust clinging to her dress, at the bag she held like a shield. Something stirred in him, not pity, but a strange recognition, as if he saw his own solitude mirrored in her gaze. He pushed open the gate, the hinges groaning in protest. "Come on, then." She followed him across the yard, her steps careful but sure. The wind whipped between them, carrying the scent of dry earth and something else. Hope, maybe, or just the ghost of it. Wade led her to the house, its door warped by years of heat and neglect. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the dust of a life left untouched. A single oil lamp sat on a table, its wick long unlit. Isabel stood in the doorway, her shadow stretching across the floorboards, and for a moment, neither moved. Wade pointed to a corner where a narrow cot leaned against the wall. "You can sleep there. Ain't much, but it's dry." Isabel nodded, setting her bag down with a soft thud. "It's enough." He stepped out onto the porch, leaving her to settle. The sun had sunk below the ridge, painting the sky in streaks of fire and shadow. Wade leaned against a post, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but his thoughts lingered on the woman inside. Isabel Thornton, a stranger from a world of brick and cobblestone, now standing in his world of dust and wind. The mesa stretched endless before him, its silence unbroken, save for the wind's low moan. But as he glanced back at the house, where a faint light now glowed through the window, Wade felt something shift. Not a promise, not a vow, but a question, whispered by the dust and the dying day. What did it mean to share this lonely place with another soul? The wind offered no answer, and neither did he. The sun rose over dry mesa like a furnace, its heat pressing down on the cracked earth. Dust hung in the air, clinging to everything: Wade Harlan's boots, the sagging corral fence, the gray wooden walls of the ranch house. Wade woke before dawn, as he always did, his body moving through the familiar rhythm of chores. He fed the cattle, checked the horses' hooves, and hauled water from a distant creek, his calloused hands stained red by the mesa's dirt. But this morning was different. The house was no longer empty. Isabel Thornton had stayed. She took the small room at the back, its shelves piled with old ropes and rusted tools. Wade had cleared it out the night before, dragging a cot and a thin blanket from the attic. Now, as he crossed the yard, he saw her through the window, stirring a pot over the stove. The smell of baking cornbread drifted out, foreign in a place that had known only cold beans and stale coffee for years. Isabel worked without complaint. She scrubbed the dust-caked floorboards, mended Wade's torn shirts with careful stitches, and even tried to coax water from the dry well, her hands blistering under the sun's relentless glare. Her dress, once fine in some eastern city, was now frayed at the hem, streaked with red dirt. Yet she moved with a quiet determination, her green eyes sharp and unyielding, as if daring the mesa to break her. Wade watched her from a distance, his face unreadable. He spoke little, answering her questions with a nod or a grunt. "Need more wood?" she'd ask, and he'd point to the pile by the shed. "Supper's ready," she'd say, and he'd sit at the table, eating in silence. But each day he noticed more. The way her hands trembled when she carried heavy buckets, the way she paused to wipe sweat from her brow, her golden hair catching the light like dry grass in the wind. Every afternoon, Isabel sat on the porch steps, her gaze lost in the endless stretch of scorched plains. The wind tugged at her hair, tangling it into knots, and she'd brush it back with a tired hand. Wade saw her there, a solitary figure against the vastness, and felt a pang he couldn't name. She was no stranger to hardship, that much was clear. But what had driven her to this God-forsaken place, to a ranch where even the earth seemed to reject life? One night, as the fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows across the walls, Isabel broke the quiet. They sat at the table, plates of cornbread and boiled greens between them, the only sounds the crackle of burning wood and the distant howl of the wind. She set her fork down, her voice soft but steady. "Does it ever feel too lonely out here?" Wade paused, his eyes on the fire. The question hung in the air, heavy as the dust that coated everything. He chewed slowly, then spoke, his voice low and rough. "If a man ain't known loneliness, he don't know when he started living for real." Isabel's lips curved into a faint smile, the first Wade had seen since her arrival. It was small, fleeting, but it warmed the room more than the fire. "I used to think it was about finding the right place," she said, her eyes distant. "Now I wonder if it's about finding the right person." Wade didn't answer. He looked at her, at the way the firelight danced across her face, softening the lines of exhaustion. Her words settled in him, stirring something long buried, a memory of his mother's voice, faint and fading from a time before the world turned hard. He pushed his plate away, the silence returning. But it was different now. It wasn't the silence of absence, but of two people beginning to see each other. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant storms. Wade stood, clearing the table, while Isabel stoked the fire. They moved around each other carefully, like dancers learning a new step. As he stepped out to check the corral, the night air bit at his skin, sharp and unforgiving. He glanced back at the house, where the glow of the hearth spilled through the window, Isabel's shadow moving within. The mesa stretched dark and endless before him, its silence a weight he'd carried for years. But tonight, that weight felt lighter, as if the presence of another soul had shifted the balance. Wade tightened his coat against the wind, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't dread it. The firelight flickered behind him, a small beacon in the vastness of dry mesa, and he let it guide him back to the house. The days at Dry Mesa burned on, each one hotter than the last. The sun scorched the earth until the ground cracked like old bones, and the wind carried red dust that settled into every crevice of Wade Harlan's ranch. Wade worked from dawn to dusk, mending fences, tending cattle, his hands rough as the mesa itself. Isabel Thornton moved alongside him, her presence now a quiet constant. She hauled water, scrubbed pots, and stitched torn blankets, her once soft hands now blistered and hard. They spoke little, but their silences had grown softer, like the pause between breaths. In the evenings they sat by the hearth, the fire's glow casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Isabel's golden hair, tied loosely, caught the light, and her green eyes, once guarded, began to soften. Wade noticed the change, though he didn't name it. He saw it in the way she lingered at the table after supper, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood, as if searching for something to hold on to. He felt it in the way his own chest tightened when she looked at him, her gaze steady but searching. One afternoon, as they repaired a broken fence under a blistering sun, Isabel spoke. They were knee-deep in dry grass, Wade hammering a post while she held it steady. Her voice came low, almost lost in the wind. "I lost my mother when I was 9. Fever took her in a week." Wade's hammer paused, but he didn't look up. She continued, her words careful, like stones placed on a fragile bridge. "After that, I lived in a Boston church. The preacher's wife fed me, clothed me, but it was pity, not love. They never listened. Not really." Wade drove the hammer down, the thud echoing across the mesa. He understood her words, not just their meaning, but their weight. He'd grown up without a mother, too, raised by saloon fights and the cold mercy of strangers. "Folks say Dry Mesa's hard," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "But it's people that make living tough." Isabel nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun bled into the earth. "I came here for hope," she said. "Not an easy life, just a chance, however small. I'm used to being turned away." Her voice cracked, but she straightened, her pride unbroken. Wade looked at her then, really looked, and saw himself, a soul shaped by rejection, yet still standing. That night, the air was thick with the scent of dust and burning wood. They sat by the hearth, the fire crackling softly, its light dancing across Isabel's face. She spoke again, her words spilling like water from a long, sealed well. "Back east, I stood outside that church one last time. I told myself I'd never beg for a place again. I chose this mesa, this dust, because even if it breaks me, it's mine." Wade leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. Her story was his own, though he'd never spoken it. The mother gone too soon, the world that offered scraps instead of warmth, the stubborn will to keep going. "You ain't alone in that," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "This land don't give much, but it don't lie either. It shows you who you are." Isabel's eyes met his, and for a moment the room felt smaller, the world reduced to the space between them. She smiled, not with joy but with understanding, a shared recognition of wounds carried in silence. The fire popped, sending a spark into the air, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Wade rose to add a log to the hearth, his shadow stretching across the floor. As he turned, he saw Isabel watching him, her face soft in the firelight, her hands still on the table. He felt a shift, subtle but real, like the first drop of rain after years of drought. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a bridge, fragile but growing stronger. Outside, the mesa lay dark, its vastness unbroken save for the faint glow of their fire. Wade stood by the door, his hand on the frame, listening to the wind's low moan. Isabel remained by the hearth, her presence a quiet anchor in a house that had been empty too long. The night stretched on, and for the first time, Wade didn't feel the weight of it alone. The wind turned feral over dry mesa, howling like a beast set loose. A sandstorm swept in without warning, its red dust clawing at the ranch house, rattling the windows until they groaned. Wade Harlan barred the door, his hands steady, but his heart uneasy. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and the faint smoke of the dying hearth. Isabel Thornton sat by the fire, her green eyes reflecting the flickering flames, her golden hair loose and tangled from the day's work. The storm outside screamed, but within these walls, a quieter tension grew. They had taken shelter together, pressed close in the small room as the world beyond turned to chaos. The fire cast shadows that danced across the wooden walls, and the wind's wail drowned out all but their breathing. Wade sat across from Isabel, his calloused hands resting on his knees, his face unreadable. She was different tonight, her usual pride softened by something raw, something that made her fingers tremble as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The storm raged on, hour after hour, stealing sleep. Isabel broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the wind's roar. "If the sky clears tomorrow, Wade, would you want me to stay?" She paused, her eyes locked on his. "Not out of pity, not because you need someone to cook or mend, but because of me." Wade's breath caught, the question sinking into him like a stone into still water. He looked at her, at the firelight carving soft lines across her face, at the strength and fragility woven into her gaze. The mesa had taught him to guard his heart, to let no one close. Yet here she was, asking for a place in a life he'd thought too broken to share. He leaned forward, his voice low, rough with truth. "I ain't never dared keep anyone, Isabel. But if you want to stay, I'll give everything I got." Her lips parted, a faint tremble running through her. She reached out, her hand brushing his, her touch warm despite the storm's chill. "I'll stay, Wade," she said, her voice steady now, though her eyes glistened. "Not for anyone else? For me." The words settled between them, heavy and sacred, like a vow unspoken. Isabel's hand lingered on his, her fingers curling slightly, and Wade felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with a warmth he'd forgotten existed. The fire crackled, sending a spark into the air, and the wind howled as if jealous of the quiet they'd carved out. She smiled, a small, trembling thing, but it lit the room brighter than the flames. Wade didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes held hers, and in that moment, the mesa's vastness felt small, the storm's fury distant. They sat there, hands touching, the world reduced to the space where their lives had begun to intertwine. As the storm began to fade, its roar softening to a low moan, the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters. It fell across Isabel's face, catching the curve of her smile, the resolve in her eyes. Wade rose to check the door, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He glanced back at her, still by the fire, her presence a steady anchor in a house that had once held only ghosts. Outside, The mesa lay battered but still, the dust settling under a pale sky. Wade stood in the doorway, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. The storm had passed, but something else had begun. A fragile promise, born in the heat of the night, that neither would face the mesa's trials alone again. Dry Mesa remained unforgiving, its red earth cracked under a sun that gave no mercy. Storms of dust swept through without warning, and the dry well stood as a silent taunt to hope. Yet Wade Harlan's ranch was no longer the same. The house, once a hollow shell of warped wood and dust, now hummed with life. Isabel Thornton had stayed, and with her came a warmth that softened the mesa's harsh edges. Each morning, Wade woke to the clatter of pots in the kitchen. Isabel stood by the stove, her golden hair tied back, her hands steady as she baked cornbread or stirred a pot of beans. She had planted a small garden by the window, coaxing green shoots from the stubborn soil. The tattered curtains, once gray with neglect, hung newly mended, their faded patterns catching the dawn's light. Every task she did, sweeping the porch, patching the roof, wove her deeper into the ranch, into Wade's life. Suppers were simple but shared. The table, once a place for solitary meals, now held 2 plates, 2 voices. The clink of forks replaced the silence Wade had known for years. Isabel's laughter, rare but genuine, filled the room like a breeze after a long drought. Wade watched her across the table, her green eyes bright with a quiet strength, and felt a truth settle in him. A home didn't need crowds, just the right soul to share it. One evening, as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows with its familiar moan, they sat by the hearth. The fire's glow painted the walls gold, and the air carried the scent of burning cedar. Isabel mended a shirt, her needle moving with care, while Wade sharpened a knife, the scrape of steel a steady rhythm. They didn't speak, but the silence was warm, woven with trust. Wade looked at her, her face softened by the firelight, and thought of the years he'd spent alone, believing the mesa would always win. Now, with her here, it hadn't. Outside, the stars burned cold above the endless plains. Wade stepped onto the porch, the night air sharp against his skin. Isabel joined him, her shawl pulled tight, her breath visible in the chill. They stood side by side, watching the horizon where the mesa stretched into shadow. "Sometimes," Wade said, his voice low, "I reckon a man don't need much, just someone who stays." Isabel nodded, her eyes on the stars. "And someone who makes staying worth it." The wind carried their words away, but the truth remained. Dry Mesa was still a land of dust and struggle, but its trials no longer felt like a sentence. Wade and Isabel had built something stronger than the storms, a home, not of wood or earth, but of choices made in the quiet moments. As they turned back to the house, the fire's light spilled through the window, a beacon against the vastness. Wade closed the door behind them, and for the first time, he knew he was no longer a lone cowboy in a red wilderness. He was home.